He stopped talking the moment I said the name. Not anger, not a hiss of wind. The sentence died on my tongue as if someone had laid a heavy cloth over the world and smothered sound. For a long beat, long enough for the chill to crawl deeper under my collar, I thought I had misheard him. Then I realized I had said the name Jesus, and the stranger beneath the streetlight had gone quiet. My name is Robert Sullivan. I'm 63, retired after 38 years of teaching high school history. For most of my life I could sleep like a sealed tin. Retirement blew that up. I began walking at night because staying in bed felt dishonest. The house is too big for one person who used to be married to routine. The quiet clattered around the rooms. Walking gave me permission to feel my own edges without the pressure of pretending I had every answer. The walk started as a way to pass time and keep the insomnia honest. They became a ritual. A flask of bad coffee in my coat pocket, a thin lamp, and the same route through the neighborhood park that still smelled, even in late November, of damp leaves and wet soil. Around 3 in the morning, the world belongs to a certain kind of thinking, the kind that pulls on a thread and keeps going until either you find the sweater or you unravel. It was on one of those walks that I met him, or maybe that is the wrong verb. I encountered him. He encountered me. The point is, we were both there, two figures under a dying streetlight, and something happened that I have spent the last year trying to explain. The figure was not ostentatious. If anything, he tried to be invisible. He stood beneath an old oak that sheds bark like confession, a small halo of sodium light making the wet leaves around him glitter. He wore a coat that could have come from a thrift store or a catalog, nondescript. His hands were in his pockets. The first impression was that he was simply another insomniac trudging the path. He spoke without moving his lips. The sound came into my head as if someone had keyed a walkie-talkie. I remember thinking absurdly of those late-night radio shows where listeners confess things into microphones. "Why are you awake, Robert?" he asked. The voice had no accent I could place. It wasn't unkind. It wasn't threatening. It was straightforward in the way a teacher pronounces a hard fact. For a moment I thought he knew my name from my mail or a neighbor, and I told myself to close my throat and move on. But curiosity has a muscle all its own. "Insomnia," I said. "Restless. Old habits." "What's restless inside you?" he asked. It was such a simple question that I nearly laughed. I had spent the better part of 2 years lecturing myself on the virtues of rest and the dangers of idle worry. I had given sermons in my own head about grace and the uselessness of guilt. But when someone else says the word restless in a night with damp leaves and sodium halos, the word accrues weight. It becomes a thing you can set your palm on. So I told him. I told him about the house that used to hum with 2 people arguing over dishes and politics and small kindnesses, about how the silence left by my wife's absence wasn't just the absence of a person, but the absence of purpose, of someone to notice whether I'd worn the same sweater for 2 days straight. I told him about the church I grew up in, how it had taught me hymns so well my voice still found the words in the dark, and about how, more recently, sermons had felt like performances that left an echo rather than a bite. I told him about Tom, my younger brother, and how some small stupid fight 12 years ago had hardened into a diplomatic freeze. I told him I felt like a man who had learned the words to a song but never learned to sing with anyone. Throughout this he listened. The voice was patient. The questions made me look at things differently. He never pressed me. He simply unfolded an attention so quiet it made me ashamed of all the noise I had been carrying. Then, after a while, he asked a direct question. "Who do you follow, Robert?" It is strange what you can feel when a question is so simple. You are forced to arrange your life into a sentence, and in doing so, you discover the loose threads. I started to answer with the practiced pieties that had shaped me. I go to church. I say my prayers. I try to live decently. The voice interrupted. "Names," he said. "Give me names, not slogans." I hesitated. The names that came were like a roster of commitments and inheritances. The church, my Sunday school teacher, the reverend who married us, the hymn-singing grandfather. Then, as if obliged by the gravity of the moment and the way his question opened my chest, I said the name that felt like the center of the ring where all the other names orbited. Jesus. When I said it, the world changed. Conversation does odd things sometimes. It has its silences and awkward coughs. But this silence was not awkward. It was the absence of sound and the presence of meaning. It was heavy and reverent and not venomous. The voice I had been hearing stopped. The streetlight hummed. A fox slipped through the underbrush somewhere, but the silence, the absence of human speech, pressed around me like a revelation. I remember my own heart in that silence. It kicked, stupidly loud, as if to remind me there was a body in the middle of the revelation. Then, after what felt like an eternity, held in a single heartbeat, the voice returned, not with the same rhythm, but with a tone that had the breadth of a room. He did not explain. He only said quietly, "Now I will show you." He told me he was a mirror. He said it like a description, not an identity. A mirror, he said, shows what is before it. It doesn't interpret. I had by that point exhausted most of the possibilities of cheeky rationalization. He could have been an odd neighbor, a lucid dream, a hallucination induced by bad coffee and older bones. I thought of calling someone. Who? And then realized it was exactly 3 in the morning and there was no one whose presence would have fit into the strange geometry of that night. So I listened, which is what teachers learn to do when they are about to be given something they didn't expect. He asked me another question. "What do you do when you speak of him?" "Do you mean in church?" I asked. "Do you mean to whom?" He corrected, a light impatience in his voice. "To him. When you say the name, what are you doing? Are you keeping him at a distance?" That was a question that landed like a fishhook. For decades, my posture toward Jesus had been, if not worshipful in the most fervent sense, then reverential, something to be admired from a respectful distance. Worship is, in many of its forms, a loving thing, songs, altars, praise. But there is a difference between keeping someone at arm's length on a pedestal and learning to follow their footsteps in the mud. He said, "There are 2 kinds of proximity. Some names invite distance. Some names demand imitation." "Which is his?" I asked, before my better self could hold my tongue. It was half a child's demand and half a scholar's curiosity. He did not answer quickly. For a moment the park seemed to inhale. His next words came as if he had chosen them from a shelf of old books. He opened the way. He spoke of the kingdom within. He said, "You are the light of the world." He said, "What I do, you can do." He told people, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross." He did not speak scripture as if announcing proof, but as if guiding me to read it like a map. The phrases had the weight of familiarity. There are lines in the Gospels that lodge under the fingernails of a soul. "You are the light of the world." Matthew 5:14. Words from the Sermon on the Mount that I could recite without thinking. "The kingdom is within you." Luke 17:21 was the kind of phrase you hand-wave through in a Sunday talk because it is tricky. "What I do you can do" is not a literal quotation from one book, and only appears as a sense of John 14:12. "Whoever believes in me will do the works that I do, and greater works than these will he do." A promise that had always felt more theological than practical to me. And then the injunction to take up his cross. Luke 9:23, Matthew 16:24. A sentence that always smelled of self-denial and distant martyrdom, something others do, not something I was asked to practice in aisle 6 of the supermarket. His voice was steady. "He did not come primarily to be admired, Robert," he said. "He came to be followed." The claim landed like a stone thrown into still water. Ripples spread. I felt startled, defensive. I had sung hymns all my life. I had wept in the church vestibule at funerals and weddings. I had called Jesus Lord with my mouth in the face of suffering and small blessing. And the idea that admiration might be a comfortable substitute for imitation felt like an accusation I could not answer without exposing the parts of me that wanted to be seen as pious without being touched. "You make it sound as if worship is wrong," I said, the words sharper than I meant. He gave a small, sad laugh. I don't say worship is wrong. Worship is worship. But worship can become an architecture that shelters us from the demands of walking. It can be a place where people stand in the nave and applaud the thought of change without changing. He wanted followers, not an audience. If this reads like an indictment of the church, hear me. I don't mean it as wholesale condemnation. The church kept me alive for decades. It fed me bread and sang to me in the dark. It taught me that prayer is not a transaction, and that sometimes we are called to stand with people who have nothing to give. But the mirror in the park that night was pointing out something I had not wanted to see. That structures and systems, priesthood, ministry, liturgy, can, by their very usefulness, become ways to outsource responsibility. People become spectators of grace rather than participants. He said, "The danger is not the building or the hymn book. The danger is when the building and the hymns become substitutes for the discipline of being like him." Because he spoke like a mirror, the test was not how much I could argue, but how much I recognized in myself. I felt my chest tighten. The old excuses came up: work, age, hurt that had calcified into identity. The mirror's reflections are never flattering. They show the parts you have trimmed away with improvisations of righteousness. "Then why did you go silent when I said his name?" I asked. It was a clumsy question, as if I thought the silence needed defending or explaining. Who would have the authority to say why a name is heavy? "I stopped," he said, "because the name is an invitation more than a title. The moment you call it a title, people have room to admire without following. The moment you call it an invitation, the space changes. I stopped to see whether you would cross that space." He did not say prove or test in the way of a forensic exam. He said it in the way the weather breaks, to see what would happen if I moved toward the edge of my comfortable worship and tried on imitation like a rough jacket against the rain. There is a way language does things. In the dark under an oak tree, the phrase "kingdom within" did not feel like a theological abstraction. It felt like a soft door hinge inside a house you had been renting but not entering. The invitation was not so much to belief as to responsibility, that we have within us a capacity to be connected to the Father, to act like him, to be conduits of light rather than curious consumers of it. "Are you saying," I tried, "that every Christian is supposed to live like those miracles I read about in the gospel? That we should be doing signs and wonders in the grocery store?" He smiled at that, a small private smile. "No," he said. "Not signs and wonders, not the patina of spectacle. What I do you can do is not only about spectacle. It is about participating in a way of life where the broken are tended, the lonely are found, grudges are risked in the hope of reconciliation. The works he did were not displays, they were acts of proximity." The more he spoke, the more my life rearranged itself under the weight of his words. He called proximity the cure for spectatorship. He called imitation the rehearsal for the kingdom. He said the kingdom is not a place you pedal to on Sunday, and then forget the rest of the week. It is an orientation that begins in a choice to be nearer to the life Jesus lived. I asked him, because a teacher's habit is hardly ever silenced, "What about the church? Isn't it the place where people learn to do this?" "Yes and no," he said. "The church is a tool. It trains, it shelters, it presses people toward mercy. But tools can make us lazy. A hammer does not build by itself. If the church becomes an answer you rely on rather than a training ground that sends you back into the neighborhood with a bandage and a listening ear, it has failed for that person. I did not come to create dependence. I came to invite participation." It was hard to hear that without thinking of my lifetime of Sunday mornings, where a culture of attendance had replaced a culture of risk. I had been taught to believe that light was something you looked at with reverence, not something you took home and installed in your apartment. "Are you saying Jesus didn't want to be worshipped?" I heard myself ask, my voice too theatrical, embarrassed by the naivete of the question. The man under the oak did not correct me with doctrinal certainty. He framed his answer in a way that kept me humble. The Gospels show a man who received worship, and who also called people into participation. That is the tension. He accepted devotion and asked for imitation. He did not reject worship, but worship can become a comfortable distance. He did not want distance. I remember the quiet that followed that exchange as an actual physical thing. My breath, the rasp of a distant rain, the small rustle of a paper bag the moon had left lying by the path. The man looked at me, and in his face there was the kind of compassion you give to someone who has been trying to solve a riddle with only half the clues. "How do you start?" I asked. It was a practical question. Theoretical insights are easy to discuss. The first step is always the hard part. He named small things. He did not say go build a ministry or plant a church. He said start with a pause. Between stimulus and response, he said, recalling something from the Stoics or perhaps a pulpit somewhere. Create a pause. In that pause, imagine the face of the person you owe, the one you have avoided. Ask, if it were him, what would I do? Train yourself with small acts of mercy. He told me to look at the Gospels not as a museum but as a handbook for apprenticeship. He quoted lines I had known for years, and in his mouth they shifted into tools. You are the light of the world. Not a crown, but a responsibility. The kingdom is within you. Not an abstract heaven, but a present orientation. What I do, you can do. Not a promise to make you dazzling, but an invitation to join the work of tending. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross. Not a celebration of suffering, but a call to humility and a willingness to bear the cost of loving someone who will not automatically reciprocate. When he spoke those last words, my mind did the sly thing of trying to qualify them away. Take up my cross. Surely that meant a radical, almost monastic call. But the man beneath the oak kept me honest. He said it meant consenting to small deaths, dying to the immediate self that wants to be right, dying to the calculation that says hurt is an excuse for withholding care. He did not romanticize failure. He didn't claim imitation is a recipe that guarantees success. He described it as a discipline, the same way you learn to swim by going into the cold. Will it hurt? I asked. Because I hurt now. Why add more? Because the hurt you have is a closed shell, he said. You are protecting a life that has not been practiced. Opening to imitation risks pain because it risks relationship. But relationship is the only place where the kingdom grows. I thought of Tom in that moment, not as a character in a memory, but as a man who had a phone number and a beat-up voice and a soft spot for bitter coffee. 12 years earlier, an argument about a property line and a funeral had escalated beyond reason. We had both been stubborn, both wounded, both pretending that silence was a more honorable posture than apology. The man under the oak had no knowledge of that history. He had only asked me to look inward and to consider how imitation begins with the smallest steps. Then do it, he said simply. It is your practice. It is a thing you either do or you don't. I laughed, a short, incredulous sound. I had read the Gospels as a man reads a star chart, admiring, sometimes inspired, often distant. The idea that they were an apprenticeship manual made me want to rearrange every Sunday morning I had ever attended. How can I start to practice? I asked, cheapening the profound with my need for a list. Start with the cross you will take tomorrow, he said. Forgive one thing. Stop preparing the next cut you will make in conversation. Let someone go first. Bring coffee to someone who never thanks you. If you live near someone who grieves, show up and stay when they want to talk. Read the gospel again and ask of each line, how would this shape my hand at the bedside or my temper in traffic? There is something gentle about being instructed by someone who refuses to sell you a program. He did not hand me a 12-step plan or a pamphlet. He handed me attention and a nudge toward practice. When the conversation ended, and it did with no trumpets or fireworks, just the man shuffling his coat and moving on down the path, I felt both lighter and more afraid. The silence that had wrapped the moment when I said Jesus now felt less like a verdict and more like a hinge. He had been quiet to make room. That quiet had revealed a question. Would I answer the invitation to imitation, or would I settle back into the comfortable ardor of worship from a distance? I walked home in that thin pre-dawn light with the conversation collecting like frost on my shoulders. For the first time in years, the scriptures came to me not as distant texts, but as urgent counsel. I found myself thinking of the lines he had quoted. You are the light of the world. It felt like a sentence with an elbow you could bump against. It required something of me. The kingdom is within you. A claim that suggested responsibility rather than inheritance. What I do, you can do. A promise that should have made my spine straighten with implication. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross. A command that left my mouth tasting of iron. I went home and did a thing I had not done for many years. I opened my Bible for hours the way my students used to open books before exams, hungry and fearful. I read the Gospels in a way I had not been taught to read them. Not for proof, not for sermon fodder, but as a manual for apprenticeship. I read the Sermon on the Mount like someone learning to repair a roof. I read narratives of healing as training sessions for compassion that have consequences. The texts didn't change. I did. There were nights, those first weeks, when I would fall asleep with the book on my chest because the words had worn me out. Reading gave me questions I could not shrug off. In the margins of my Bible I scribbled notes. How would I act like this at the grocery store? Who in my life needs a call I am refusing to make? When did we substitute admiration for action? I was surprised by how often the answers involved small, ugly things. A name pulled from the shadow of the do not call list. A meal left at a doorstep. A moment of forgiveness tucked into a conversation. The imitation the man under the oak had spoken of was not always glorious. It was often sweaty and humiliating. At church, things looked the same outwardly. Hymns still rose like slow doves. People still clasped hands and sang as if the act itself were a prophylactic against loneliness. But I started to notice the ways our church practiced worship in a way that made it easy to feel pious and hard to feel responsible. Sermons still lifted spirits. Potlucks still made the fellowship warm. And yet I could not shake the observation that the cost of discipleship rarely translated into the minute-by-minute life of most congregants. We prayed for the downtrodden and sometimes sent money. We hosted a drive for coats. But we were also a community where people could feel absolved by attending, as if the sacrament of presence were sometimes a substitution for the sacrament of neighbor. This is not to heap blame. Institutions hold people together. They teach liturgy and craft aesthetics that can carry meaning across generations. They create space where many people learn their first prayers. I owe them my voice. The mirror under the oak had not told me to burn the church down. He had asked me to look at how I used the institution. Was it a place that trained us to go into the world and be instruments of mercy? Or was it a place where we came to refill our spiritual tanks and then drift away? The paradox gnawed at me. I had benefited from structure. I had been formed by it. And yet what had been formed within me had sometimes calcified into something that sheltered me from the messy work of imitation. One night after a particularly long reading session, I found myself scrolling through my phone until I found Tom's name. My thumb hovered over the call button. For 12 years the number had been a fossil on my screen. There, lived in the data but untouched. It felt like a moral litmus test now. Would I cross the street of my resentment and risk the small, shattering thing of apology? I could have closed the Bible and told myself the world was delicate enough, that some fractures are not meant to be reopened. Instead, I did the only cheap, cowardly thing. I rehearsed different openings in my head, and then dismantled them. I thought of the minister who once said, "Reconciliation isn't a magic spell. It's a practice that takes time and does not always end in perfect restoration." That sentiment appealed to the stubborn part of me that feared spectacle. If reconciliation could fail, then perhaps trying was not vanity but faithful risk. On the night I almost called, I did not yet have the courage. I ended up leaving a handwritten note in the margin of my Bible instead. First step, call Tom. I am honest about my failures because the mirror under the oak had been honest about mine. Progress would not be a tidy curve upward. It would be a series of missteps and small restitutions. That is where I will leave this particular walk for the moment. The beginning of a restless apprenticeship. I cannot tell the end of the story because I have not lived it yet. I can only tell you the change that took place in me. A movement from admiration to apprenticeship, from comfortable worship to the hard, ordinary decisions of imitation. The silence when the name was said did not condemn me. It invited me to a practice that required more than Sunday mornings. If this opening hits a nerve, leave one word in the comments, awake or comfort. I asked that once in the park in my own small way, and the echo that returned was both humbling and sustaining. The next morning I woke with the echo of that park conversation in my chest like a persistent thrum. The page of my Bible where I'd scribbled, "First step, call Tom," felt like a dare. Breakfast tasted of stale toast and bravery. I told myself I would call after coffee. I told myself many things that week. We are inventors of excuses. But the man under the oak had shifted something in me. Admiration had ceased to be enough. The question now was practical. Would I risk looking ridiculous, repentant, vulnerable on the phone to a brother who had every right to hang up and never answer again? When I finally pressed his name on my screen, it was almost comical. The way my thumb hovered, then leapt away, then hovered again. Each avoidance felt like a small, dishonest sermon to myself. "You are not that person anymore," the sermon said, and then I would promptly behave like the person I had always been. It took me 2 nights of muttered rehearsals, a conversation with an old student who'd become a therapist, and some nervous pacing around the living room before I had the nerve to press call. The phone rang once, twice. I remember thinking the silence between rings yelled at me, "This is the moment." On the 3rd ring, his voice came, older than the last time I'd heard it, raw in a way my memory hadn't prepared me for. "Rob?" he said. His tone was not warm. Neither was it a slam-door coldness. It sounded like a door that had been shut and sometimes rattled but had not been nailed shut. There was a tremor in it that could have been the years, or could have been something more tender. Maybe both. "Tom," I said, and my mouth shaped my confession like a small, awkward coin. "It's me." We managed the first awkward sentences the way 2 people attempt to arrange mismatched furniture in a room. We skirted around the funeral, the property dispute, the bit of unkindness that had snowballed into architecture. I had rehearsed an apology in the mirror and found it inadequate. What came out the first time was clumsy and incomplete. I told a smaller truth, that I had been wrong, that pride had kept me silent, that I missed him. It sounded thin even to my own ears. Silence is a different thing on the receiving end. You send your shame into the air and then you wait to see if it will be caught or dropped to the pavement. When Tom answered, he breathed for a long time. Then he surprised me. "I thought about you once," he said, voice flat. "At the hardware store. You would have hated the selection. I didn't call." "Neither did I," said. There was a pause long enough for regret to accrete on both sides. Then, a tiny thing. "You okay?" he asked. "No," I said simply. It felt like truth, and the truth is a kind of medicine that sometimes tastes like copper. "I'm trying to be." We talked like 2 men learning a new language. Occasionally one of us would lapse into the old, sharp grammar of accusation, and the other would have to back up and offer a softer phrase. I said things I had never said out loud, about the vulnerabilities that had driven me into the hermit-like routines of retirement, about the embarrassment of needing someone, about the emptiness that had become company. He told me things too. Bitterness had hollowed his Sundays. The children had grown distant amid the noise of life. His wife had left town 2 years ago. His confession was not a demand for absolution. It was, in its own way, an offering. "I don't know if I can forgive everything," he said at one point, and I did not argue. I had no right to demand immediate reconciliation. "Forgiveness," the man under the oak had told me, "is a practice, not a dramatic fix. It is a series of small reorientations, not a single jump." "Can we meet?" I asked, voice small. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "Saturday, diner on Route 8, noon." "Coffee's on me," I blurted. "No," he said. "Bring the coffee. Bring the apology." We laughed, brittlely. There was no cinematic hug when we saw one another. The diner smelt of burnt coffee and vinyl booths. Tom looked thinner but alive in some stubborn, embarrassing way. We sat across from each other like a pair of ex-students who had been failing the same assignment for too long. His hands were thick from manual work. Mine fidgeted with a napkin as if purpose could be folded into origami. The conversation that followed was not the tidy reconciliation of a film. There were tears, on his part, quieter than mine. There were sentences that stopped midway and then finished 3 minutes later. I confessed my pride. He confessed his own stubbornness. At one point we both laughed in the face of our ridiculousness, and that laughter felt like an unlocked window. "Why'd we let a stupid thing do this to us?" he asked, voice small. "I don't know," I said. "Fear, pride, the parts of us that prefer being right to being whole." We left that day without promises of instant restoration. We left with plans to speak on the phone every Sunday, to meet for lunch once a month, to keep the fragile project going. It was not a happy ending, it was the honest beginning of the practice the man under the oak had described. The weeks that followed were instructive in ways I hadn't expected. Reconciliation did not come as a single cliff leap. It crept in through habits. The first Sunday call to Tom felt clumsy. Sometimes we would be unable to reconcile contentions. The past has teeth. But the presence of the attempts changed both of us. He showed up at my house one afternoon bearing a casserole and stories about a mutual cousin we hadn't seen in years. I found myself letting slip some of the old sarcasm that used to be our armor, and he nudged me with a joke that disarmed the rest of it. One holiday, awkward and small, we ate at a kitchen table that had been unoccupied for too long, and discovered that the rituals of family could be relearned like muscle memory. These were not miracles in a headline sense. They were not the kind of swift, spectacular displays that make strangers weep in the pews. They were, instead, the slow knitting together of two men practicing a different grammar. The man under the oak had been right. Proximity is where the kingdom grows. It grows not through the extraordinary, but through these clumsy, faithful acts. At home I began to test the pause the man had suggested. The first time I did it deliberately was in a supermarket. A woman in the produce aisle had chosen the last bunch of parsley I'd been eyeing. Something in me wanted to assert my preference as a form of petty vindication. Instead, I remembered the oak's instruction. Imagine the face of the person you owe. For a moment I tried to imagine empathy instead of ownership. I stepped aside and offered a smile. We talked about recipes and grandchildren, and when I left the store I felt something loosen in me, as if a stitch I hadn't noticed had been mended. There were harder tests. At church, an argument about a community outreach budget rose like fog one Tuesday night. Two leaders, both earnest, both claiming to represent the good of the group, snapped at each other until the air tasted of old grievances. My instinct was to take the righteous side, to point out where the other was wrong with the precise logic of a retired teacher. Instead, I flagged the conversation out loud. "How would Jesus move here?" I asked. The question disarmed two men angry in defense of opposing visions. It did not solve the budgetary disagreement, but it reframed the discussion from who was right to what would tend the suffering. Suddenly the room had a different goal: mercy, rather than victory. This practice did not make me pious. It made me clumsy in new ways. I apologized more publicly and frequently. I embarrassed myself with attempts at humility that sometimes read as performative. I failed at loving people who were unlovable. I was rejected more than once by people who thought my apologies too late or too little. Yet the repetitions hardened into habit. Small acts added up. The man under the oak had spoken of imitation as discipline. I now understood discipline as repetition, not as heroic spontaneity. One evening, a neighbor named Maria, an elderly woman who lived across the hall, fell ill. I found myself standing outside her door, unsure. I remembered the oak's instruction to look and then show up. I brought soup. I read aloud from the Psalms she knew by heart. She dozed while I held her hand, and in that small room I felt oddly close to something I had only understood in theory. There was no proclamation, no sudden healing, only a tired woman who slept while someone kept vigil. The kingdom, such as it was, arrived in the unflashy form of presence. Small acts began to ripple. At a Wednesday night Bible study I started bringing simple prompts. How would this verse shape your conversation with the neighbor you avoid? The answers were sometimes awkward. People admitted to grudges that had calcified into identity, but confession precipitated action. A young man who had been vehement in his opinions offered to mow the lawn of an elderly congregant who hadn't left her house in weeks. A woman who never spoke during meetings showed up at the community kitchen and stayed until the last plate was cleared. None of us were claiming triumph. We were simply rehearsing a new muscle. To act like the gospel said, we could act. Not everyone received my new attention kindly. An older deacon eyed me with something like suspicion. "You're sounding like the newest program," he said at the coffee hour, stirring his coffee with a finger. "What is it this week, Robert? Practicing being Jesus?" He meant it as a barb. I did not ward it off with a defense. I admitted, "I'm learning to be less of a spectator." He harumphed, but his face softened after a moment. Some people need time to trust that action that looks like imitation isn't hubris. Others will always assume motive is suspect. I learned to accept the friction. These tensions brought me back more than once to the Gospels themselves. In my rereading, I began to see threads I'd missed in decades of singing hymns and listening to sermons. The Sermon on the Mount felt less like an ethereal moral ideal and more like a training manual for the body of the believer. "You are the light of the world," Matthew 5:14, was not an ornamental compliment. It was an assignment. "The kingdom is within you," Luke 17:21, became a claim about access and responsibility. The promise that, "Whoever believes in me will do the works that I do," John 14:12, no longer read as a future, unreachable mystique. It read as a present vocation. Tend the broken, practice humility. Restore where possible. And then there was the cross. I had read those words for years as if they were an artful metaphor for suffering at large. Now they sounded like the daily offer of a rusty tool that required practice. "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross." Luke 9:23. Deny myself. How? Not necessarily through dramatic asceticism, but by small refusals. Refusing to respond with the cutting line that would prove me clever. Declining to pass judgment when swift condemnation feels satisfying. Choosing to apologize without recalculating the balances of who owed whom. Each small denial was its own cross, and I learned how heavy even the smallest cross could be. Failure remained faithful. I snapped at clerks in moments of fatigue. I kept silent when I should have spoken up for someone. I misapplied patience and allowed injustice to coast by while I watched from the sideline. The imitation I was learning was not a ladder to instant moral superiority. It was a series of messy attempts. Sometimes I would fall back into the comfortable posture of worship from a distance. Sing the hymn, attend the service, feel sanctified for an hour, then retreat into the old patterns. The man under the oak had not offered a magic formula that removed the need for perseverance. He had rather given me a mirror and asked me to keep walking toward what it showed. One afternoon, as winter eased into something like thaw, I found myself once more walking the park route. Old habits are resilient. The path felt familiar. The bench that had a missing slat. The oak that shed bark like confession. I half expected to see the man again, an impulsive wish that maybe, for the price of a confession, someone would make the hardness of living easier. I saw instead a young woman sitting on the bench, head bent over a dog-eared New Testament, crying softly. I sat beside her without speaking. After a time, she introduced herself as Jenna. She had been through what she called a spiritual drought, and had come to the park to be where people used to be with their faith. Public, ritual, performative. She looked at me with the exact kind of hunger I had felt months before. We talked. She told me about being on the receiving end of a congregation that was big on prayer requests and small on showing up. I asked the question that had loosened my life. "When you say the name, what do you do?" She blinked at me, unfamiliar with the idea that naming could be an action rather than just a statement. That conversation nudged me into an awkward sort of mentorship. Me, a retired teacher who had arrived at the same learning curve, sharing the clumsy homework assignments of imitation. I suggested practical things. Bring a casserole to the neighbor who's quiet. Sit with someone in grief. Stop preparing the next argument in the middle of a conversation. She asked if there was a group that practiced these things. I had to say no. In truth, our church lacked a formal apprenticeship structure. It had the hymns and the liturgies and the weekly comforts, but not a disciplined program of small, repeated acts of mercy and accountability. I took that deficiency to the pastor. He is a sober, textbooks and soup man named Pastor Daniel, a man who taught me to read the Psalms with an eye for their lament and their architecture. When I told him about my walk in the park, his face did not do the incredulous thing. He listened and after a long breath said, "We may have worshipped our way into a false security." He did not say we to accuse. He said it with the heavy humility of someone who knows institutions take on lives of their own. "Let's start a small apprenticeship group," he suggested. "Not a program with a slogan, but a cohort of people who will do the homework. Read the gospel and try one thing each week." We began modestly. 6 people, one side of the fellowship hall, cups of coffee that would overheat before they were finished. The format was simple: read a passage, discuss practical implications, commit to one small act, report back. The first week, a woman named Claire brought a report about delivering a pie to a neighbor who had lost a husband and who hadn't left the house in months. She'd been nervous. The neighbor had been suspicious. The pie had been left on the doorstep with my-rated nervousness. 2 days later, the neighbor had left a note. "Thank you for sticking." That note changed Claire's posture. She litters her life now with similar small acts. The apprenticeship group did not become a miracle factory. It became instead a place where practice could be named and failure could be admitted. We learned to laugh at the awkwardness of humility. We learned to console one another when our attempts at kindness were misunderstood. The group taught me something crucial. Imitation thrives in community when community is brave enough to be messy. The ripple effect reached beyond our church walls. Word spread slowly and not always gracefully. A local soup kitchen started inviting a small team of volunteers from our group. They sent people out to repair broken furniture at a nearby veterans shelter. One member's son began a tutoring program for refugee children. None of these things were spectacular on social media. They weren't headline material. They simply represented more people doing the small work of proximity. People asked me sometimes if the man under the oak had been an angel or an odd sleeping walker, or a projection of my own conscience. I stopped insisting on a categorization. The man had functioned as a mirror, and mirrors can be material or metaphysical, or a combination. The identity of the mirror did not matter as much as the work it invited. If anything, keeping him ambiguous preserved the ethic. The work didn't hinge on the nature of the messenger, but on the testimony that I could be different in practical ways. There were moments that tested the new habits. An old friend accused me at a funeral of seeking virtue theater, that my apologies and small acts were a way of redeeming public image. It hurt. Where once I might have retorted sharply and retreated into a shell of righteousness, I did the harder thing and listened. I apologized for any performance and admitted the truth. I had been performing for a long time. The admission tasted like iron and relief. Another test came in the form of failure I could not fix. Mary from down the street, whom I had visited when she first fell ill, did not recover. I had read to her, held her hand, sat with her son who had no time for grief. After she died, I sat in the pew and felt the pang of impotence. The imitation did not spare her. The gospel did not guarantee a miracle. I killed any naive expectation that kindness equates to outcomes. Instead, I learned to see my actions as fidelity, not as results. That reorientation helped me bear sorrow without assuming it was a failure of faith. All of this, my fumbling calls to Tom, the soup, the apprenticeship group, the awkward apologies, began to integrate into a theme I hadn't expected. The man under the oak had not merely called me to imitate. He had nudged me into accepting the sober dignity of responsibility. The kingdom became, in a way, redefined in my mind as a present obligation rather than a distant vacation home. The idea that the kingdom is within you, Luke 17:21, no longer meant comfort so much as capacity. We are entrusted with small spaces where light can appear if we stop squinting at it from afar and instead do the work of tending. Some evenings, when the house was quiet and the clock ticked in that precise way older houses do, I would walk again to the oak. The park seemed different now. Where once it had been a place to have encounters, now it felt like a training ground. I would sit on the bench and read aloud a passage, sometimes Matthew's telling of the Beatitudes, sometimes John's chapter where Jesus speaks about the vine connection, and hear the words like instructions. Blessed are the merciful, Matthew 5:7, read like an assignment. Whoever believes in me will do the works that I do, John 14:12, became less a promise of sensational deeds than a call to consistent compassion. One night, months after the first meeting under the oak, I turned a corner and saw him. Or perhaps he saw me. He was leaning against the same tree, coat in the same nondescript fashion, hands in pockets. I don't know why the sight of him caused a quick oldness to lift in me. Perhaps we begin to understand our teachers better the more we practice. Perhaps the human appetite for mystery tempers the human appetite for certainty. You've been busy, he said, not as a surprise but as an observation. I've been making a mess of it, I admitted. Mostly, but I'm learning. He smiled without sentimentality. The mess is part of apprenticeship, he said. People imagine imitation is a clean thing. It's not. It's a stubborn daily task. We spoke briefly about ordinary things. He asked about Tom. I told him about casseroles and the weekly calls and the afternoons with coffee that were long on silence, but also long on presence. He asked about the apprenticeship group. I told him the truth, that it had started small and had the strange credibility of people who are willing to be awkward together. He nodded, eyes folding into something like approval. Do you ever want to know who I was? I asked suddenly, a child's curiosity pushing up through an old man's civility. He shrugged. Names are less important than what you do. I existed where you needed to see. The form a mirror takes is not fixed. And the silence when I said his name, why did you stop? I asked, pushing at the hinge again, partly to understand, partly to test if the oak had only been a one-time parable. He looked at me with an expression I had trouble naming. Because I wanted to see if you would cross the room, he said simply. Silence can be a place to see whether someone will move toward proximity or remain in the audience. We sat in the black of the park for a while. There were no trumpet-blown revelations, no cosmic handshakes. He got up before dawn, tugged his coat tighter, and walked away along the path as if heading for a destination I could not map. When he left the feeling of a mirror that had been taken down and stored. It was a strange sense, gratitude folded into a renewed sense of agency. I did not need a stranger to stand as my mirror forever. The work had to be practiced even when the mirror was nowhere to be found. Months turned into a different kind of habit. I still failed. I still fell back into the comfortable arms of admiration. I still loved hymns and the quiet safety of liturgy. But I had at least altered the architecture of my worship. It now tended to spill into afternoon care, to extend into phone calls, casseroles, and awkward apologies. I had come to believe that the question the man under the oak had posed, when you say the name, what do you do, is the simplest litmus test of faith. The church responded in different ways. Some people embraced the apprenticeship idea with hunger. Others treated it with suspicion, as if introducing human agency into the work of God risked some theological impropriety. Pastor Daniel, with the steady pragmatism of someone who has seen fads come and go, kept encouraging practice without moralizing. We must be a people of small acts, he would say. The kingdom will not be built on our clever programs, but on the fidelity of tripped and humble hands. There were critics, too. Some cried that focusing on imitation undervalued worship, as though to do one meant you could not do the other. I never argued that worship was useless. The first years of my life would have been empty without morning hymns and communal prayers. Rather, I began to see worship and imitation as two limbs of a body. One draws breath in gratitude, the other translates that breath into the awkward work of neighbor love. At one of our meetings, a young father stood up and read a passage from Luke. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily. Luke 9:23. He told us how that sentence had saved him from the daily temptation to storm out of his house whenever his 2-year-old tantrumed. Instead of rage, he learned to step into the child's distress as a place of discipline for himself, to teach the child how to be steady, not to be made steady by control. The story of the young father became a small parable everyone in the room could relate to. I realized imitation had a domestic scale as much as an outreach one. As the year crested into another autumn, I found the unexpected, exultation in small fidelity. The word miracle sat uneasily in my mouth now. I would not make folk promises. In our world, suffering continued. The homeless still slept on the undersides of bridges. The hospital still took names and months. Families still crumbled under pressure. But within my small radius, things were different in humble ways. People acted rather than merely admired. The world did not always bend to those actions, but the actions made our lives recognizable to one another. A neighbor's son told me, months after my first conversation with the Oak Man, that his mother had stopped drinking because someone from the apprenticeship group had shown up one evening with a stack of takeout and a listening ear. Another woman said she felt less alone because a church member quietly mowed her lawn while she recovered from surgery. These are not blockbuster events. They are the quiet tendings that keep neighborhoods from falling apart. There is a dignity to them. Sometimes, in the middle of ordinary nights, I felt the man's silence again. Not the moment of that original hush, but a quieter sense, like the echo of a bell you only half heard. It reminded me that faith might require not only acts of imitation, but the willingness to step toward hard conversations and to stay near the ache. The silence had been an invitation to proximity, and proximity, I had learned, is often unglamorous work. If there is anything I can say without making a catechism of my experience, it is this: saying Jesus' name is not the end of things. It can be the beginning of a practice that asks everything of you, not your holiness to parade, but your willingness to be present, to apologize, to persist when gratitude fails, and when forgiveness is slow. The identity of Christ is not here offered as a simple ethical model, nor am I suggesting that imitation dissolves the sacred uniqueness of Jesus. I am saying, in the humble voice of a man who has spent a life in classrooms and a few strange nights in parks, that the Gospels issue an invitation to enter into a life that looks like his. That invitation might be accepted in public worship, but it is lived out in hours that no one will write about. Once in winter, when the park was a place of bare branches and the oak's bark flaked like the pages of an old book, I walked to the bench and recited a line I had come to love. "You are the light of the world." Matthew 5:14. I thought of the small lights we were practicing, lamps brought into dim houses, a phone call at the right hour, a casserole on a damp step. The light did not always dispel the dark. Sometimes it simply made the darkness more bearable. The man under the oak never claimed that imitation was easy. He had told me as much the night he first fell silent. He also refused to let me remain comfortably reverent without work. If he had a single point, it was this: that the question of proximity or distance matters. You can sing about the sun and never step outside. You can admire a lighthouse and never walk toward the shore. The gospel, he suggested, calls us toward the shore. One morning I took out my Bible and read Luke 9:23. "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily." And then Matthew 5-7, the Sermon on the Mount, as if I were a student assigned to do the homework of the kingdom. I wrote in the margin, "Practice this week. Call the one you avoid." The margin was a small covenant with the person I was trying to become. I will not claim that the choice to imitate is an easy formula to follow for everyone. There are those whose wounds make proximity dangerous, whose histories require slow repair and careful time. The man under the oak did not hand me a one-size-fits-all method. He handed me a lens and a habit. Look, then move. When you fail, return and try again. He reminded me that the church is both a place of gathering and ascending. It can sanctify ritual, but must also press out people who will do the hard neighbor work with unsexy persistence. If this story has any purpose beyond the confession of an old teacher who once preferred the polished praise of worship to the filthy work of imitation, it is to invite you into an experiment. Read one of the Gospels in the next 48 hours, Luke 9:23 or Matthew 5-7 if that feels like a bigger bite, and ask of each line, how would this shape the way I speak at the store, the person I call when the phone sits quiet, the neighbor I avoid? Then choose one small thing you will try this week and do it. It needn't be heroic, it must be honest. I cannot answer the great questions of how heaven and earth will finally be reconciled, or whether every act of imitation will yield fruit in the way we hope. I only know that the silence the man held when I said the name Jesus was a pivot that invited me to move from admiration into apprenticeship. The rest is practice, messy, repeated, necessary. If you decide to try, tell someone about it. Tell a friend, join a group, or even write one word in a comment. The practice begins with naming and moves into doing. For me, the path from silence to proximity began under an oak at 3 a.m. For you, it may begin at your kitchen table, at the grocery checkout, or with a number on your phone you have been avoiding. I still walk the park sometimes. The oak still sheds its bark like slow confession. Sometimes I find myself looking for the man and realizing that the work of imitation has made him less necessary. The mirror has been set down, and I am learning to be the kind of mirror for others. I am learning to be patient with the clumsy ways people practice faith. The invitation remains. When you say the name, what will you do? If you feel called to start, take one small step this week. Read a passage, make a call, offer a simple apology where it is owed. Share one small thing you'll try in the comments. No showmanship, no perfection, just one honest attempt at proximity. If nothing else, try the experiment. See whether imitation shapes your ordinary hours into the kind of life that looks like the gospel asked for, not as a performance, but as a practice.